The smoke hit first, bitter, metallic, thick enough to sting the throat before anyone could fully see where it was coming from. Inside Mir, on 23 February 1997, a device meant to make breathing easier turned into an oxygen generator fire. A hard white flame, molten sparks, and smoke with nowhere to go. That is the part people remember. But it was only the first wound. When we talk about the 1997 Mir space station collision and onboard fire, we usually compress it into a headline, as if this were one bad day in orbit. It wasn't. It was a station already under strain, then hit again months later by something even worse. First, the canister ignited and filled the station with smoke. Then, on 25 June 1997, an unmanned Progress M34 cargo ship slammed into the Spektr module during a manual TORU docking test. And here is why this story still feels wrong, even now. The collision didn't just damage equipment, it punctured Spektr. Air began leaving a crewed station for vacuum, the first Spektr depressurization in human orbital flight. Commander Vasily Tsibliyev, engineer Aleksandr Lazutkin, and NASA astronaut Michael Foale were suddenly forced into a choice you never want in space. Save one part of your world or lose all of it. They cut cables, they sealed the hatch, and in doing that, they kept the station alive. But they also triggered the next failure. If you like real space stories told minute by minute, subscribe, because the fire was only the warning. Before the hull was ever punctured, the station had already shown the crew what a sealed emergency feels like. On 23 February 1997, that canister was supposed to buy them air. Instead, it turned into a torch. A sustained flame, bright and vicious, throwing molten metal into the cabin. In weightlessness, those glowing drops don't fall away. They drift. They hang there. And the smoke? It doesn't rise neatly toward a ceiling, because there is no real up there. It spreads into the space where people still have to breathe. That is what makes the oxygen generator fire so hard to explain to anyone on Earth. A room fire gives you exits, windows, corners to run toward. Mir gave them hatches, narrow passages, equipment, wires, air that had to stay inside, and smoke that had nowhere to leave. The smell would have been sharp and chemical, the kind that coats the mouth. Visibility shrinks fast in a closed volume. Your eyes sting, your throat tightens, and every second you spend locating the source is a second inside the same atmosphere the flame is poisoning. So when people later talk only about the impact, they miss something important. Vasily Tsibliyev, Aleksandr Lazutkin, and then Michael Foale after him were not entering a comm station that suffered one bad docking. They were living inside a place that had already taught them one brutal rule. On Mir, the system built to keep you alive could become the next thing trying to kill you. After the smoke, the station did not feel safe again. It felt used up. The crew had to keep living inside the same metal shell, with scorched air ducts, tired equipment, and the memory of that oxygen generator fire still hanging over every switch they touched. On Mir, there was no clean reset. You repaired what you could, you isolated what you had to, and you kept going, while the place reminded you that it had already failed once. That mattered, because the next danger was not a leak and not fire. On June 25, 1997, the manual TORU docking test began with Progress M34. This time, the threat came from a cargo ship that was supposed to be guided in carefully, by hand, toward a station that was already running with less room for error than anyone wanted to admit. And inside the station, Tsibliyev, Lazutkin, and Michael Foale were not just watching numbers. They were watching the balance of the whole place: power, position, and time. The work was quiet on the surface, but the stakes were not. One bad touch, one wrong closing speed, and the old damage would not matter anymore, because the station would be dealing with a new one. That is the part that makes the 1997 Mir space station collision and onboard fire so hard to shake. The fire had shown them what a sealed home looks like when the air itself turns hostile. The docking test would show them something worse: how fast a station can go from fragile to broken when a moving object is allowed to close the last few meters. And Progress M34 was already coming in. By the time the manual TORU test began, Mir was already carrying the memory of that oxygen generator fire. So this was a fragile station, a crew that had already seen smoke inside sealed walls, and an unmanned Progress M34 being brought in by hand. On paper, it was a docking check. In practice, it was one more moment where the whole place depended on judgment, timing, and a machine that did not forgive hesitation. Tsibliyev was at the controls. Lazutkin was inside the station, and Foale was there too, watching the same closing movement from a different angle. That matters, because in orbit you do not feel distance the way you do on Earth. You read it, you estimate it, you trust the numbers, until the numbers start asking for more trust than they deserve. And Mir had already taught them what happens when trust runs thin. The cargo ship came in toward Spektr, and the approach did not stay calm for long. A few meters too much, a few seconds too late, and the line between test and impact vanished. The station had no room for a second mistake. Not after February. Not with the Soyuz lifeboat still waiting as the last real way out. You can feel the shape of the danger here, even before the hit. One moving object, one vulnerable module, one crew trying to hold the station steady while the closing distance keeps shrinking. If the approach goes wrong, the consequence will not be a bump. It will be a breach. And the next moment is the one nobody on board could stop. What followed was short, violent, and far more dangerous than the word collision usually sounds. Progress M34 slammed into Spektr, a hard strike into a module that was part of the station's living body. Metal took the hit, structure gave way, and then the real emergency began. Because in orbit, impact is only the first event. The second is what the damage lets happen next. Spektr was punctured. That meant air was escaping into space from a crewed station. The hiss may not have been loud in the way people imagine, but the consequence was immediate. Pressure was no longer staying where it belonged. Inside Mir, every wall, cable, hatch, and sealed passage suddenly mattered in a new way. The station had crossed into something no crewed outpost had faced before: a true breach in an inhabited module. Tsibliyev, Lazutkin, and Michael Foale were now dealing with Spektr depressurization. And that phrase sounds clinical until you picture it properly. Air is time. Pressure is time. Every second the leak stays connected to the rest of the station, the whole complex is being pulled toward vacuum. You do not get to debate that. You isolate it, or you risk losing everything attached to it. But Spektr could not simply be shut like an empty room. Power lines ran through that hatch. Cables fed the station through the very opening that now had to be sealed. So the next decision was worse than the impact itself. To keep the air, they might have to cut the electricity. That was the decision point. Not elegant, not theoretical, and not something you get to rehearse with calm hands. Spektr was leaking, and the hatch could not close cleanly with cables still running through it. Those lines were part of the station's circulation, power passing through a doorway that now had to become a wall. So Tsibliyev, Lazutkin, and Michael Foale were forced into one of the ugliest choices spaceflight can produce. Keep the wires, lose the air, or save the pressure and cut away part of the station's future. They chose the air. Picture the scene for a second. Floating inside a damaged module with metal around you, panels, handholds, loose gear, and the knowledge that vacuum is already on the other side of the breach. The crew begins cutting cables by hand. No dramatic music, no clean surgical move. Just insulation, connectors, cramped motion, and consequence. Every cable severed meant one less path for electricity. Every second spent delaying meant the leak stayed connected to the rest of Mir. Then the hatch was sealed, and with that, the immediate Spektr depressurization was stopped. The station was still inhabited, the crew was still breathing, but survival had come at a price you could feel almost at once, even if nothing outside the window looked different yet. Spektr's solar power was no longer feeding the rest of the complex the way it had before. The air had been saved. Now, Mir had to survive what that rescue had just cost it. That cost showed up fast, because Spektr had not just been a room. It had been a source of power. When the crew sealed it off, they did more than stop the leak. They cut away access to solar arrays that had been feeding the station. Roughly half the electrical power was gone. And on an orbiting station, power is never just lights. It is control, orientation, systems that let the whole structure know where it is facing and how to stay there. So the emergency changed shape again. First, it was fire. Then impact. Then loss of air. Now it became attitude control loss. Mir began to tumble. And that word sounds slow until you think about what it means in orbit. A drifting station cannot hold a steady orientation. It stops presenting itself properly to space. It stops behaving like a stable platform and starts acting like wounded hardware, turning with less authority than it needs. Inside, nothing dramatic had to explode for this to become terrifying. The walls were still there, the hatches were still shut, the crew was still alive, but the station wasn't holding itself the way a station must. What had been a punctured module was now becoming a full, complex problem, because loss of power had led directly into loss of control. If you've ever wondered how space emergencies really work, this is the part most films skip. The first failure is often survivable. The second one is the one it triggers. And now, Tsibliyev, Lazutkin, and Michael Foale had to answer a new question inside a station that wasn't steady. How do you stop a place from drifting when the part that helps stabilize it is sealed behind a hatch you cannot reopen? That question was not abstract anymore, because once the station began drifting, every choice on board changed with it. A stable outpost gives you something precious without anyone noticing. Reference. Walls stay where you expect them. Equipment belongs to a system that knows how it is pointed. After the collision, that quiet certainty was gone. With roughly half the power cut off by the loss of Spektr's solar arrays, the station no longer held itself the same way. The emergency had moved from the punctured module into the motion of the whole complex. And this is where Michael Foale becomes central in a very different way. He was not there to perform some dramatic rescue move. He helped compute the station's spin. That sounds dry, almost small, until you picture what it means inside Mir. If the place is drifting without clear orientation, you first have to understand how it is moving before you can do anything useful about it. You cannot correct what you have not measured. In orbit, a wrong guess about motion is not just a math error, it can deepen the problem. So now the three men were dealing with a station that had already survived fire, then impact, then a leak, and was now in attitude control loss. Tsibliyev had command responsibility. Lazutkin had engineering reality in front of him. Foale helped turn motion into something the crew could think with. That is the rhythm of real space emergencies, by the way. First comes shock, then comes arithmetic. But knowing the station is rotating is not the same as stopping it, and Mir still had to prove it could be steadied before the power situation got even worse. Once the spin was known, the next problem was uglier: how to stop it without making the power situation worse. That is the trap inside the 1997 Mir space station collision and onboard fire. A station can survive a hole, and it can survive a fire, and it can even survive losing part of its power. What it struggles with is all three pressing at once, while the whole structure is slowly turning out of alignment. Mir was no longer just damaged. It was becoming harder to point, harder to manage, harder to trust. So the crew had to work from the inside of the problem. Foale helped turn the motion into numbers. Tsibliyev and Lazutkin had to think like men living inside a machine that would not hold still. Every correction mattered because every correction cost something, and the place did not have much left to spend. That is what makes the phrase attitude control loss sound so clean compared with the reality. In truth, it meant the station was drifting away from any stable frame the crew could use to plan the next move. And this is where space stops feeling heroic and starts feeling physical. A wall becomes a reference point, a window becomes a tool, a shadow becomes evidence. You are trying to keep a wounded habitat from turning itself into a blind, useless shell. The big question now was simple and terrible. If Mir could not hold its orientation, what else would fail first? Power? Temperature? Or the crew's last margin of time? So the fight now was not against flame or leaking air, but against drift. Inside Mir, that changes the feeling of everything. A station that tumbles is still a station, but it stops behaving like one. The crew is no longer dealing with a single damaged spot behind a sealed hatch. They are dealing with the consequence of that seal. Half the power gone, the balance of the whole complex changed, and every technical decision now tied to orientation. Foale's work on the spin gave them something precious, a way to describe the motion instead of just enduring it. Tsibliyev and Lazutkin had the harder part after that. Knowing how the station is moving does not fix the movement. It only tells you what kind of danger you're in. And this is where the chain of failures becomes brutally clear. The manual TORU docking test leads to impact. The impact leads to Spektr depressurization. Sealing Spektr saves the air, but cuts off the module's power contribution. Loss of power leads to attitude control loss. One problem stacks on top of the last one. If you listen closely, that is the real sound of this story. Not one loud crash, but systems peeling away one by one. The crew had prevented vacuum from taking the station. Now they had to keep the station from slipping further into disorder. Not by force, not by luck, but by understanding exactly what was still working and what was already gone. And that raises the next hard question. After fire, collision, depressurization, and drift, what does saving Mir even mean now? That answer was beginning to change in real time. At first, save the station had meant something simple: stop the leak, keep breathing, prevent the whole complex from emptying into space. But after the hatch was shut and the drift began, the meaning narrowed. Now it meant living inside a version of Mir that had been permanently rearranged by one collision. Spektr wasn't just damaged, it was gone from the crew's usable world, sealed off behind a barrier that had been closed to keep everyone else alive. And that changes the emotional weight of the place in a way raw data never quite captures. The station was still there, yes. The familiar walls, the narrow passages, the equipment, the routines, all of it remained. But one part of that world had been cut away by hand. Cables had been severed. A module had been sacrificed. The same station that had survived the oxygen generator fire now carried a second kind of injury, quieter than smoke and slower than a leak, but more lasting. You can keep flying in a wounded habitat. The question is what that habitat asks from you afterward. For Tsibliyev, Lazutkin, and Michael Foale, that meant every future action had to pass a new test. Does this spend power? Does this depend on stable orientation? Does this assume Spektr is still part of the station in any practical sense? Even the Soyuz lifeboat, sitting there as the last clean escape, changes meaning when you know the station is still alive, just not whole. And the deeper you look at it, the harder the next question becomes. Were the fire and the collision two separate emergencies, or symptoms of one station already operating too close to failure? That question matters because the closer you look, the less these events feel isolated. On paper, the sequence can be split cleanly. On 23 February 1997, a canister ignites and fills the station with flame and smoke. On 25 June 1997, Progress M34 strikes Spektr during the manual TORU test. Different days. Different mechanisms, different immediate dangers, but if you stay with the details, a pattern starts to show through the metal. The pattern is accumulated fragility. A station that has already endured an oxygen generator fire is not returning to innocence. A crew that has already watched smoke spread through sealed compartments does not approach later risk the same way. Then comes the collision, the puncture, the cut cables, the sealed hatch, the loss of power, the drift. None of those steps erases the one before it. They pile up. The place keeps functioning, but on narrower margins each time. That is why the story keeps resisting simple language. If you call it the fire, you miss the impact. If you call it the collision, you miss the months of warning built into the year. What happened aboard Mir was a chain, not because one event directly caused the other, but because each exposed how little spare capacity the station really had left when something went wrong. And once you see it that way, another truth becomes harder to avoid. The station did survive, but survival is not the same thing as recovery. And the next part of this story lives in that difference. That difference is where the human side of the story really settles in. A station can remain in orbit and still be changed beyond recognition for the people inside it. After the leak was stopped and the worst of the drift understood, Mir did not snap back into its old shape. It had to be lived in differently. One module was sealed away. Power had been cut down hard. They had to think around damage now, not past it. And that is a quieter kind of survival, the kind most people never picture. Tsibliyev still had command of a station that no longer answered like the one he started with. Lazutkin still had engineering problems that had not disappeared just because the pressure held. Foale, who had helped turn the station's motion into something measurable, was now part of the same stripped-down reality as the other two men. The walls were familiar. The logic of the place was not. This is why the story resists the clean word saved. Yes, the crew remained alive. Yes, the complex remained inhabited. But every one of those facts now depended on choices that had reduced what the station could be. Spektr was behind a closed hatch. The electrical loss was real. The earlier fire still belonged to the same year. Nothing about that felt like restoration. If anything, it felt like they had managed something harder to describe. They had kept a damaged world from crossing the line into abandonment. And once you say it that way, the final question stops being technical. What exactly did 1997 reveal about how close human spaceflight had come to discovering its limit? What 1997 revealed was not a clean boundary in spaceflight, but a ragged one. Mir did not vanish after the oxygen generator fire. It did not die when Progress M34 struck Spektr on 25 June 1997. It lost air, lost cables, lost power, lost orientation, and still remained inhabited because Vasily Tsibliyev, Aleksandr Lazutkin, and Michael Foale kept making the kind of decisions that do not look heroic while they are happening. Cut this, seal that, measure the spin, work with less, except that one part of the station is gone so the rest can keep breathing. That is the real ending of the 1997 Mir space station collision and onboard fire. Endurance inside a machine that had already used up its margin. When people picture survival in orbit, they often imagine one dramatic save. This was harsher than that. A torch of flame in February, a puncture in June, a hatch closed on live cables, a darkened module left behind. The station stayed with them, but only after they agreed to let part of it go. And maybe that is the image that matters most here. Not the impact, not the smoke, but a sealed hatch in a narrow passage, with the crew on one side and the sacrificed compartment on the other. After that, the station is quieter, smaller, still turning above Earth. If this kind of minute-by-minute space history is your thing, stay with the channel. There are more stories like this waiting in the dark.